The tin was open, and his hands already knew what that meant. Aldrin Koss had been on his knees in the eastern rows when the notification arrived. His fingers were in the soil, checking moisture depth the way he checked it every morning, pressing down to the second knuckle and reading the resistance. Good soil told you things. It pushed back evenly, or it didn't, and either way it was honest. He had been farming Reservoir III for 28 years, and the soil had never lied to him once. The notification came through a channel that officially did not exist. He read it standing up, which he hadn't planned. His knees straightened without him deciding to stand. The screen in his palm showed 4 lines of text and a single authorization code, and the Galactic Council's emergency override stamp in the upper corner, the one that had never in his lifetime been used. Below it, a number, 220,000. Below that, the word children and then the word colony and then a coordinate he already knew by memory because he had run simulations against it 412 times. 14 months later, a ship the size of a small moon would hang over an amber-lit ringed world, and 280 warships would open fire on it simultaneously, and the ship would absorb every shot without returning a single one. But that morning, Aldrin Koss just stood in his nitrogen rose with wet hands, and read the message twice, and then walked inside and opened the tin. It was on the shelf beside the seed packets. It had always been on that shelf. His neighbors assumed when they noticed it at all that it held something agricultural. Heritage grain, maybe. A specialty cultivar. They never asked and he never explained, and the tin sat there for 28 years, and no one found that strange. He set it on the kitchen counter and lifted the lid. What came next the Galactic Council called unprecedented. Gareth Venn called it something else entirely. Stay with me. 14 months earlier, Reservoir III was the kind of world that made lists. Best agricultural output in the 6th compact sector, 4 years running. Lowest incident rate of any colony world above population 30,000. Winner of the Regional Sustainability Citation, twice. For nitrogen management practices that the citation committee called innovative and that Aldrin privately considered obvious. The colony filed its annual crop report on the 3rd day of each administrative cycle without fail, and the report was always accurate, and no one in the regional office had ever opened it past the first page. The nitrogen readings in the southern sector ran slightly warm, not alarmingly, just enough that a careful person might note it and a careful person never had. Aldrin Koss had won the Regional Composting Prize 4 years running. His neighbors considered this a personality trait. He considered it cover, which was not entirely fair. He did genuinely care about compost. The two things were not in conflict. He had learned early that the best concealment was actual competence at the thing concealing. He taught agronomy on Tuesdays to whoever showed up, which was usually 6 to 12 colony children between the ages of 8 and 14, sitting in a half circle on overturned crates in the eastern greenhouse, while condensation ran down the transparent panels, and the 3 suns outside cast overlapping shadows across the beds. He taught them about soil chemistry and root systems, and the way nitrogen-fixing bacteria worked, which he found genuinely interesting, and which they found tolerable. The children liked him. He liked the children. This was real, and it did not cancel out the other thing. Every night at 2 in the morning, he ran war simulations. He had been doing it since he was 43. The program was buried 4 encryption layers deep in a system that appeared, to any external scan, to be a crop yield projection tool. He ran scenarios against every major military power in the known galaxy, updated his variables quarterly with data delivered through the same silent channel as this morning's message, and had never once found a scenario he could not resolve. This had worried him more than failure would have. Failure meant a gap to fill. Perfection meant he hadn't found the gap yet. He set the tin on the counter. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a square of treated cloth, was a titanium alloy disc 9 centimeters across. The edges were worn smooth, not from damage, from handling. Every morning for 28 years, his left hand had gone into his pocket and found it there, and his thumb had moved across the edge the way a tongue finds a loose tooth, automatically, almost without awareness. The fleet designation was etched along the face in script so fine it required magnification to read. He had not needed magnification in 20 years. He had carried it like a stone you keep meaning to put down. Every morning it was in his pocket. Every night it was on the shelf beside the seed packets. He told himself it meant nothing. It meant everything. He pressed it between his palms, feeling the familiar weight of it, and then he put it in his pocket where it belonged and went to make the calls that would end his life as a farmer. The neighbor knocked on his door at 8:30, the way she did on alternating Tuesdays, holding a ceramic jar of fermented grain product that smelled aggressively of something Aldrin had never been able to identify. He bought a jar from her every time because her operation was small, and the profit margins on specialty fermented goods were unkind. He set the jar on the counter beside where the tin had been. He noted that he should refrigerate it later. He did not refrigerate it. 14 months later it was still there. "You look terrible," she said, which was her standard greeting when something seemed off. "Long night," Aldrin said. She studied his face with the particular attention of someone who had lived next door to a quiet man for 2 decades and had learned to read the quiet. Whatever she saw, she filed it and let it go. "I've got extra squash coming in next week. You want some?" "Yes," he said, "thank you." She left. The door closed. Outside, one of the 3 suns was clearing the ridge line, and the shadow of his greenhouse fell long and thin across the nitrogen rows. That was the last normal conversation he would have for 14 months. 22 light-years away, in the operational center of the Tharric Dominion's 7th Fleet Command, a creature named Supreme Executor Garath Ven was reviewing a file he had personally commissioned 11 years ago. He was 2.3 meters tall. The exoskeletal ridge that ran shoulder to shoulder gave his silhouette a particular geometry, wide at the top, narrowing to a waist that looked structurally insufficient for the weight above it. 4 eyes in a horizontal band across the upper face, pale gold in standard lighting. Ritual scarification across the throat plate. 14 marks, 1 for each campaign command he had completed successfully. He had no vocal cords. He spoke through a vibration membrane set behind his jaw, which meant that every word he produced was a deliberate physical act. He was constitutionally incapable of whispering. Everything he said arrived at full volume, shaped only by control. The file concerned humanity. Specifically, it documented 2 centuries of observable human behavior in galactic space, diplomatic postures, trade patterns, aid program distributions, cultural exchange frequencies, response times to interspecies conflict, and the consistent, measurable tendency to de-escalate under pressure. The data was extensive. The conclusion it supported was, in Garath Ven's assessment, unambiguous. Humanity was a staging species. The Dominion's classification system had been developed over 400 years of galactic expansion. A staging species was one that had entered galactic civilization without the structural orientation toward conflict that characterized militarily competitive powers. They built infrastructure. They developed medical and educational capabilities that they distributed generously, which the Dominion's analysts categorized as resource misallocation driven by sentimental behavioral patterns. They negotiated rather than maneuvered. They accumulated territory slowly, through agreement rather than force. A staging species was not a threat. It was a resource waiting to be redirected. Garath Ven had studied humanity for 11 years. He had filed quarterly assessments. He had run projections. He had cross-referenced 2 centuries of human diplomatic response against every known model for conflict-capable civilizations and found no match. Humanity did not fit the profile of a species that could sustain a military campaign. Their ships were transport and exploration class. Their population was distributed across hundreds of worlds in a pattern that made coordinated response structurally impractical. He had every variable. He had the wrong model. He didn't know that yet. On Reservoir III, a woman named Yenna Koss was unpacking her deployment orders in a dormitory room on the colony's emergency response campus when she noticed something that had not registered on her 4 previous deployments. The words "emergency response" in her orders were in quotation marks, not the way official documents used quotation marks when citing a formal title. The way someone used them when they were being precise about the gap between what a thing was called and what it actually was. She was 26. She had been in emergency response training since she was 8 years old, which she had understood as a normal feature of growing up in a family that took civil preparedness seriously. Her grandfather had encouraged it, had run strategy exercises with her during holidays, had taught her to read a tactical map before she could drive. She had thought of these as games. She had been exceptionally good at them. She stared at the quotation marks for approximately 30 seconds. Then she kept reading. The orders were for a fleet support posting. She was to report to a staging coordinator she had never heard of, aboard a vessel whose registry code did not appear in any public database she could access. Her rank was lieutenant commander. She had not known she was a lieutenant commander. The document indicated she had held that rank for 6 years. Her hands on the document were steady. That steadiness was the thing that would become her tell. Yenna Koss, when frightened, became very still and very precise. Her sentences got longer and grammatically complete. Her friends from the training program, and she would realize later that all of her friends had been from the training program, had learned to watch for it. When Yenna stopped using fragments, something was wrong. She sent her grandfather a message that said, "I think I have some questions." He replied 11 minutes later, which was fast for him. It said, "I know, I'm sorry it's this way. I'll explain everything I can when I see you. For now, trust the orders." She trusted the orders. She did not stop having questions. The attack on Vareth Colony happened on a founding day morning. 220,000 people had gathered for the annual ceremony on the colony's central plain. It was a tradition that went back to the original settlement. The whole colony turned out, families spreading across the grass, children in the choir staging area in front of the main platform, the smell of communal cooking from 100 different cultural traditions mixing into something that wasn't identifiable as any of them, but was somehow unmistakably human. A boy named Davin, 9 years old, had drawn a map of the colony that morning. He had been working on it for 3 weeks, labeling the greenhouse districts and the water reclamation towers, and the school where his mother taught, adding small illustrations in the margins, a plant here, a fish shaped near the reservoir. He left it on the kitchen table when his family walked to the ceremony grounds. He had been going to show it to his teacher. The Tharric fleet emerged from a transit point 1,100 kilometers above the colony's equator. 7 ships. The attack lasted 22 minutes. There were no transmissions, no demands, no military communication of any kind. The Tharric vessels moved in a systematic pattern, their targeting precise, and when the 22 minutes were over they transited out without acknowledging a single hail from the 3 orbital platforms that remained functional long enough to send one. The map was still on the kitchen table when the response teams arrived. 220,000 dead, 80,000 of them were children. The Tharric Dominion released a statement 48 hours later. It described the action as a necessary correction of human territorial overextension. It used the phrase, staging species, 7 times. It referenced 3 star systems that the Dominion considered within their expansion zone, and cited 200 years of human diplomatic behavior as evidence that humanity would recognize the rationality of withdrawal and proceed accordingly. Supreme Executor Gareth Venn expected a response within 90 days. He expected it to involve negotiation. He expected it to involve, eventually, concession. He did not expect silence. The silence lasted 3 weeks. Every human diplomatic post in Dominion-adjacent space went dark simultaneously, which was the first thing that troubled Gareth Venn's council, though they did not allow it to trouble them significantly. All human aid programs in Tharric-connected systems suspended. All human commercial traffic rerouted away from Dominion space. The borders, and humans had never maintained hard borders before, which the Dominion's analysts noted, closed. A species retreating, his intelligence director said. The behavioral pattern was consistent with a staging species absorbing a strategic shock and withdrawing to reassess negotiating position. He would receive an envoy within 3 months. The envoy would be authorized to discuss terms. Gareth Venn accepted this assessment. He had 11 years of data supporting it. In the outer rim of the Alven Collective's observation territory, a collective node cluster that had been monitoring the situation filed a formal request for emergency arbitration with the Galactic Council's Conflict Mediation Division. The request was declined by Dominion proxy within 6 hours. The silence continued. It was not, Gareth Venn would understand much later, the silence of a species in shock. It was the silence of a species opening its closets. On Reservoir III, 3 weeks after the Verath attack, Aldrin Koss walked to the southern sector of his hydroponic fields at midnight and stood above a ventilation grate set flush with the soil between 2 nitrogen beds. The grate was designed to look like agricultural infrastructure. It was, technically, agricultural infrastructure. It did circulate air. It also circulated air from the 14 sealed berths that occupied the bedrock 40 meters below the surface, each berth large enough to house a warship, each warship maintained by a crew of 4 on rotating 30-year silence oaths. He crouched and pressed his palm to the grate. The air coming through it was cooler than the night air above, and it carried the faint metallic undertone of recycled coolant. The crops above them were real. The silence below them was realer. 14 berths, 14 ships, and Reservoir III was one colony world out of hundreds. He had not invented this. He had inherited it from the people who had inherited it from the people who had built it 2 centuries ago, in the early years of galactic contact, when humanity had looked at the shape of the galaxy and made a decision that they had never, in 200 years, put in writing anywhere it might be found. The decision was simple. It was, we have been here before. We know how this ends if we are not ready. So we will be ready, and we will hope with everything we have that we never need to be. He stood up. The 3 suns were all below the horizon and the stars were out, and somewhere among them was Verath Colony, or what remained of it. He went back inside and sent the activation sequence. It took 17 minutes for the first acknowledgement to arrive. It took 6 hours for all of them. By the time the last fleet commander confirmed, Aldrin had made himself a meal, eaten it standing at the counter, and washed the dishes because there was no reason not to. He was still himself. He was not only himself. Both of those things were true and had always been true. The command seal was in his left pocket where it belonged. The Galactic Council's emergency session convened 31 days after the Verath attack. Aldrin was not in the chamber. He was aboard a vessel whose public registry listed it as an agricultural transport. Yenna Koss was at a console 3 decks below him, running pre-deployment checks on systems she had trained on for 18 years, while believing she was being trained for disaster relief. The rest of the crew, 41 people, ranging from 23 to 67 years old, had the same background: emergency response, civil preparedness, strategic games with grandparents who asked very specific questions about force projection and supply chain interdiction. The chamber session was, by all observer accounts, unremarkable. The Tharric ambassador delivered a prepared statement reiterating the Dominion's position. Representatives from 11 other species said careful, non-committal things. The Salen ambassador, whose species had been cataloging galactic political patterns for longer than most civilizations had existed, sat quietly at the end of the table and watched the empty human seats with the particular expression that her species produced when they were recalibrating something they thought they had already understood. The human seats were empty because humanity had recalled every diplomat, all of them, simultaneously. This had not happened before. Down the hall from the main chamber, in a small observation room that the Council's administrative staff used for overflow seating, a junior analyst from the Alven Collective was writing the fastest message of his distributed consciousness's life. He had been assigned to monitor the human withdrawal for the past 3 weeks. He had been filing reports. His supervisors had been reading them and responding with careful, bureaucratic acknowledgement. He stopped filing reports. He sent a direct communication to his home node that bypassed the standard relay chain. "Something is wrong with our model," he wrote. "I don't know what yet, but something is very wrong with our model." His home node's response took 4 days. The Alven Collective moved at the speed of consensus. By the time the response arrived, it was already irrelevant. Cassador's drift was a border system the Tharric Dominion had held for 60 years. It had a garrison of 35 ships. These were not the Dominion's most advanced vessels. Border posts rarely were, but they were competent ships with experienced crews who had been posted there long enough to know the system's gravitational quirks and who trusted their defensive positioning. The garrison commander had served in 3 campaign commands. She knew how to hold a system. She had never seen anything like what arrived on the 43rd day after the Verath attack. 400 ships came out of transit simultaneously, emerging at 4 different points around the system's outer boundary. The transit signatures were clean, not rushed, not staggered, precise, as if someone had rehearsed the choreography and had time to get it exactly right, which, as it happened, was accurate. The Tharric garrison responded immediately and correctly, according to every doctrine they had been trained in. They formed up. They challenged the incoming fleet on standard frequencies. They requested identification and stated their intent to defend the system. The incoming fleet did not respond to the challenge. It advanced. Yenakas was at a secondary weapons console on a support vessel positioned at the edge of the engagement zone when the first exchange began. Her job was fire coordination for a 6-ship section. She had trained for this configuration for 3 years. Her hands moved through the pre-authorization sequence, and she noted, with a clinical detachment that surprised her, that they were steady. The Tharric ships fired first, plasma arrays full charge, the kind of volley that should have disrupted shields on anything smaller than a heavy cruiser. The front rank of the human fleet's shields flared blue. Null-depth shielding absorbed plasma impact by converting the energy to heat-bled waste, distributed across the hull surface as bioluminescence. Aldrin's engineering teams had spent 60 years refining the dispersal algorithm. In testing, the shields had held against simulated bombardments that exceeded anything in the current Tharric arsenal by a factor of 3. In practice, they held better. The Tharric garrison fired for 90 seconds before the human fleet responded. When it did, it used precision excision munitions, weapons that had required 60 years of targeting algorithm development, designed to identify military infrastructure and leave everything adjacent to it intact. The garrison's command vessel lost its weapons array and propulsion. The ship itself was untouched. The crew had time to recognize what was happening before it finished happening. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. At the end of it, 31 Tharric ships had been rendered combat ineffective. 3 had surrendered. 1 had managed a transit out. The commander transmitted a damage report to Dominion High Command on her way out of the system. Gareth Venn received it 90 minutes later. He read it twice. His vibration membrane went still. His staff, who had worked with him for an average of 9 years each, had never seen him go still before. The Dominion's response was swift and confident. An ambush, his intelligence director said. A prepared position. The humans had known Cassador's drift's defensive profile and had staged a strike they had been building toward. It was a statement, not a capability. It did not represent what humanity could actually sustain. The border defenses were being reinforced. The incident would be analyzed and answered. Gareth Venn approved the reinforcement orders. He reviewed the Cassador's drift report again. Then he called for a secondary file he had not previously requested, a complete inventory of human cultural exchange programs in Dominion space over the past 50 years, cross-referenced against military deployment data. The analyst assigned to compile it was a small Tharric female, 40 years in the intelligence division, who had spent the better part of her career studying human behavioral patterns. She had filed 18 reports over the years suggesting that the human data presented interpretive challenges. Her supervisors had consistently classified these reports as overcautious. She began compiling. She filled her water vessel. She drank half of it, set it down, and did not pick it up again for 6 hours. By the 3rd hour, she had stopped making notes and was simply reading. By the 5th hour, she had stopped reading and was sitting very still with her 4 eyes fixed on a particular data cluster that she had opened and closed 3 times, as if reopening it might change what it said. It did not change. She requested an immediate briefing with the Supreme Executor's Council. Her request was granted for the following morning. She spent the intervening hours building her presentation, and then taking it apart and building it again, because the first version was too long and the second version was too short, and the third version was the correct length but kept making her feel, when she read it, like something had gone wrong in her reasoning. Nothing had gone wrong in her reasoning. The briefing was scheduled for 9 in the morning. She arrived at 8:30 and sat outside the chamber and watched the other council members file in and thought about the water vessel on her desk and how she should have drunk the rest of it when she had the chance. Aldrin Koss received the report from Cassador's Drift in the middle of drafting deployment orders for the second wave. He read it, he set it aside, he went back to the deployment orders and finished them. Yenna's operational log came through an hour later, standard after-action format, precise and thorough, notable for what it didn't include. No emotional language. No commentary on what it had felt like to participate in a genuine engagement for the first time. Just data. Ship designations, weapon discharge counts, shield activation records, outcome summary. He noted it, filed it. Then he opened a private message channel and sent her 3 words, "Good work today." Her reply took 4 minutes, which was longer than she normally took to respond to him. When it came, it said, "I spoke in complete sentences for about 20 minutes after. Thought you should know." He almost smiled. He did not smile often. He wrote back, "That's how you know it was real. Get some sleep." She did not, as far as he could tell from subsequent logs, get much sleep. He didn't either. He was back at the simulation console at 2 in the morning, running the next 3 engagements against revised Dominion defensive projections, updating variables, finding the gaps he hadn't closed yet. The command seal was on the desk beside him, not in his pocket, because when he was working, he liked to be able to reach it without thinking. He was always able to reach it without thinking. The next morning, Tharric High Command received an intelligence file from an analyst whose name most of them had never learned, despite the fact that she had been filing reports for 40 years. She stood at the front of the briefing room and delivered her presentation in the flat, methodical cadence of someone who had decided that the only way to say a thing this large was to say it plainly and let the room catch up. Humanity's intelligence files on the Tharric Dominion, she said, contained 217 years of data. Every trade negotiation conducted in that time had included a secondary observer, not an official one, an embedded one, human personnel whose primary function appeared from the outside to be logistical or diplomatic, but whose secondary function was systematic cross-referencing of military deployment patterns against publicly available Dominion infrastructure data. Over 217 years, this had produced a picture of Tharric military capability, tactical doctrine, defensive architecture, and personnel psychology that was, as far as she could determine, more comprehensive than any document the Dominion itself possessed about its own operations. Every cultural exchange program had been an intelligence operation. Every medical mission had included signal collection equipment. Every goodwill initiative had involved personnel who returned home and filed classified reports. The word impossible was said 11 times in that briefing. She counted. She had expected it. She waited each time for it to finish being said, and then she continued. The Tharric Dominion, she concluded, had spent 200 years being studied by a species they had classified as a staging species. The Dominion believed they were being admired. They had been mapped. She closed her presentation. The room was silent. Gareth Ven's pale gold chitin had gone amber. His vibration membrane was motionless. The 4 eyes in their horizontal band were fixed on the display screen, which showed, in clinical precision, the psychological profile of every senior Dominion commander currently serving, including himself. The silence stretched. Outside the briefing room windows, the amber sky of Vorinth Prime looked exactly the same as it had looked yesterday. The capital city moved through its morning routines. Transport vehicles crossed the elevated lanes. Citizens went about the things citizens did. None of them knew yet. None of them knew what had been built over 200 years, patient and quiet, in the dark beneath the soil of 100 farming worlds. None of them knew what Aldrin Koss had been counting every morning for 28 years. The analyst picked up her data pad and waited. She had been right for 40 years. She did not feel satisfied about it. 1536. Gareth Venn stood up from the briefing room table and issued 14 orders in 4 minutes. Full defensive consolidation across all 7 border sectors. Recall of the 3rd and 4th Fleet reserves from their training rotations. Emergency review of all human personnel currently operating in Dominion-adjacent space, which, the logistics officer pointed out, was no longer relevant because there were no human personnel operating in Dominion-adjacent space. They had all left 3 weeks ago, simultaneously. The orders were executed. His staff moved with practiced efficiency, the way they always moved when he was in this particular register of controlled urgency. None of them told him what the secondary intelligence feed had just shown them. 14 additional human fleet signatures had appeared simultaneously on the outer border, not near Cassador's drift, not clustering around a single point. 14 separate points, distributed across the full length of the Dominion's frontier, spaced with the kind of geometric precision that required either extraordinary coordination or extraordinary preparation, or both. His operations officer brought him the report while he was still issuing the last of the consolidation orders. He read it without pausing. He finished issuing the orders. Then he set the report face down on the table and looked at his analyst, who was still standing at the front of the room, data pad held with both hands, waiting. "How long," he said, "have they been planning this?" She did not hesitate. "Based on the infrastructure data in the secondary files, our best estimate is 217 years. The room was very quiet. "Since first contact," he said. "Since first contact," she confirmed. Round 4 did not look like a battle. It looked like a diagnosis. 14 human fleets, each sized to the defensive capacity of the sector it was entering, emerged at the outer boundary and advanced at a pace that gave the local garrisons time to observe exactly what was coming before they had to decide what to do about it. The pace was not mercy. It was information delivery. The garrisons were being shown something. What they were being shown was this. The human fleet knew every installation in their sector, every defensive position, every contingency protocol. The approach vectors were not optimal for speed. They were optimal for demonstrating knowledge. Each fleet moved as if it had a map, because it did, drawn over 2 centuries of careful attention. Gareth Venn received sector reports in batches. The first batch arrived 40 minutes after the border crossings began, and it described the same pattern in 14 different systems. Human ships advancing, Tharric defenses engaging, shields absorbing, precision munitions cutting military infrastructure, civilian architecture untouched. 17 different garrison commanders used variations of the same phrase in their reports. The phrase was, they knew exactly where to hit. They had always known exactly where to hit. The second batch of reports arrived 2 hours later and was shorter, because there were fewer installations left to report from. Aldrin watched the tactical display from the bridge of his command vessel and said very little. He had run this scenario 412 times. The real engagement was tracking close to simulation variant 37, which was not the worst variant and not the best. It was the honest variant, the one he had always considered most likely, built on the assumption that the Dominion's commanders were competent and would make correct decisions under pressure. Correct decisions under pressure were not enough, not against this. Yena's section reported in at the 3-hour mark. 6 ships, objectives completed, 0 casualties, requesting next assignment. He approved the next assignment and sent her a routing code for a position 2 systems over. She replied understood, moving. He noted that her message contained 1-word fragments. She was no longer frightened. He wasn't sure whether that was better or worse. The messages coming into Gareth Venn's command bunker became fragmentary on the second day. Not because the transmissions were damaged, because the installations sending them were. Reports from the border sectors arrived with increasing gaps, the way a conversation sounds when someone is talking while moving away from you, each transmission a little quieter, a little less complete. His communications officer began prefacing each batch with a count: 42 installations reporting, then 31, then 19, then 11, then 7. Between the reports, Gareth then reviewed the analyst's files. He found the section on human medical missions. He found the embedded signal collection equipment specifications, documented in technical detail that suggested someone had been tracking this for a long time. He found the cross-referenced cultural exchange data, 2 centuries of goodwill initiatives that had served dual purposes so seamlessly that even knowing it now, examining it carefully, he could not find the seam. He had been admired, he had thought. He had been mapped. Outside, the amber sky of Vorinth Prime was moving through its ordinary afternoon light. The capital was going about its business. Citizens who had celebrated the Verath correction 3 weeks ago were, at this moment, probably doing ordinary things. Eating, arguing, planning, entirely unaware that the border defense network they had been told was impregnable, was currently being removed, system by system, with the deliberate patience of someone who had planned exactly this for longer than most of them had been alive. His intelligence director came in with a new assessment. Fresh projections, he said. The human advance was not sustainable. Their supply lines were extended. Their coordination would degrade. Within 3 to 4 weeks, momentum would stall. Gareth then looked at him. He thought about the analyst's file. 217 years of supply chain cross-referencing. The humans knew his logistics better than his logistics division did. "Leave," he said. The intelligence director left. The communications officer looked up from her console. 12 installations reporting now, then 10. Yenakas received a private message from her grandfather on the 41st day of the campaign. She was running pre-operation checks on her console, standard review, 43 line items, none of them complicated. She went through them methodically, the way she went through everything, noting greens and flagging 2 minor calibration readings for the engineering team. Around item 27, she glanced at the private message indicator, saw it was from him, and filed it to read after the checks. She finished all 43 items. She ran the flagged calibrations again to confirm. Then she opened the message. It contained 1 sentence. "Your grandmother would have been proud of how you've handled this." She stared at it. In 26 years, she had never heard her grandfather mention her grandmother in anything other than the most incidental way. A brief reference here, a corrected memory there. The subject had the quality of a room with the door kept closed, not locked, just not opened. She had understood without being told that the grief was old and personal, and not her place to press on. He had never said her name to Yenna, not once. And now, in the middle of an active campaign, with 17 things that required his attention more urgently than a message to his granddaughter, he had sent her this. She filed it. She did not respond. She pulled up the tactical feed and checked the status of the 6 ships in her section, all of them holding position correctly, all of them quiet. Something was different about the campaign's trajectory. She couldn't name it precisely, but the pace of the advance had changed in the last 48 hours. Not slowing, not accelerating, shifting. The fleets were repositioning rather than pressing forward, and the repositioning had a particular geometry, and she knew enough about her grandfather's simulation variants to recognize the shape of it. He was setting something up. She didn't know what, but he had sent her that message now, not before and not after, which meant whatever was coming, he had decided it was the right time to say a thing he had been carrying for a long time. She kept working. Round 5 was a single ship. The Tharric Orbital Defense Network around Vorinth Prime identified it at 0.3 light seconds out, flagged it as unknown class, a classification that had not appeared in Tharric records in 40 years, because there had been nothing to put in that field, and immediately began tracking solutions for the 280 warships already moving to intercept. Unknown class was technically accurate. The vessel did not match any configuration in any military database the Dominion possessed, because it had not been built according to any configuration the Dominion had ever imagined needing to account for. It was larger than the station that orbited Vorinth Prime's largest moon. Its movement was unhurried. It decelerated on a trajectory that kept it well within weapons range of the capital for an extended period, which was either extraordinary arrogance or the behavior of something that did not consider weapons range a relevant factor. The Defense Fleet commander gave the engagement order before the vessel had finished decelerating. 280 ships opened fire. The null-depth shielding activated across the carrier's hull and the surface went blue, not partially, not in sections, fully, evenly, corner to corner, the way a material behaves when the engineering behind it has been tested beyond what the attacking force can produce. The blue held without fluctuation. The plasma dissipated as heat, spreading across the hull surface in slow, even dispersal patterns. No return fire. The fleet kept shooting. 40 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 minutes. The shields held. The carrier continued on its approach, slower now, the particular patience of something that has made its point and is waiting for it to land. At 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the Defense Fleet commander broke radio silence and asked his weapons officer what their current effective yield against the target's shielding was. The weapons officer said, "Negligible." The commander said, "Keep firing." They kept firing. At that moment, Aldrin Koss was in the command center of his vessel, watching the tactical feed, his hand resting on the edge of the console, the command seal in his left pocket where it had spent the last 14 months. He was watching because he needed to be watching, and because some things you do not delegate. His executive officer was beside him. Neither of them spoke. The carrier's broadcast system activated. Every screen on Vorinth Prime received it simultaneously. Personal devices, civic displays in transit stations and market districts, the screens in the government buildings and the screens in the residential towers, and the screens in the small shops in the neighborhoods that the Tharric capital's tourism infrastructure described as traditional. Every one of them. The footage was not what anyone expected. It was a colony world on a founding day morning, families spread across grass. Children in choir formation on a platform, mouths open, faces concentrated on something above them. The particular chaos of communal cooking, dozens of different smells mixing in the open air. A boy of about 9, running between 2 adults who were laughing at something he had said. It ran for 40 seconds, then the attack. 7 ships above the equator, 22 minutes, systematic, no transmissions. The silence of it was its own category of information. Then the aftermath, the response teams arriving, the map on the kitchen table drawn in a child's hand, labeled in careful letters, greenhouse district, water reclamation, school. Then the names, 220,000 names. They scrolled for a long time. The carrier's voice came when the names finished. It did not sound angry. Anger has a texture to it, a heat, a quality of something burning through. This was not that. This was the voice of a species that had already passed through anger and come out the other side into something that had no equivalent word in Tharric. "We came to you as neighbors," the voice said. "We healed your sick in 7 Tharric systems over 40 years. We taught your young in programs your government called goodwill, and we called something else entirely. We asked for nothing except to be left alone to build what we were building. You killed our children because you decided we were not a species. You decided we were a category." Pause. "We are not a category." In his command bunker beneath the capital, Gareth Venn watched his wall display, which was showing him the same footage every other screen in the city was showing. His vibration membrane had gone still. His chitin was the darkest amber his staff had ever seen it. On the feed from the orbital cameras, he could see the protests beginning in 3 districts simultaneously. The carrier continued, "We have not touched your civilians. We have not struck your hospitals or your schools or your food infrastructure. We have weapons we have not used. We are showing you both of these things deliberately at the same time so that you understand what a choice looks like." Footage now of burning Tharric military installations across 14 systems, base after base. Weapons platforms gone. Supply depots gone. The fleet reserve stations that had been the cornerstone of the Dominion's second strike capability gone. All of it targeted with the same precision that had characterized every engagement in the campaign. Surgical. Controlled. the civilian architecture in every frame untouched. The choice of what happens next belongs to your people, not your government. On his command deck, Supreme Executor Gareth Venn sat down, not in his chair, on the floor, his four eyes fixed on a middle distance that contained nothing in particular, his vibration membrane motionless. The four eyes in their horizontal band had gone dim in the way Tharric eyes went dim when the processing load exceeded normal parameters, a biological response to cognitive overload that he had never, in 14 campaigns, experienced before. He had studied humanity for 11 years. He had every variable. He had never once put into any model the possibility that a species capable of this had spent 2 centuries actively choosing not to do it. That was the variable, not capability, choice. He had classified choice as a soft factor, unmeasurable, analytically irrelevant. He had been wrong about that, in a way that encompassed everything else he had been wrong about. Outside the bunker windows, the first district was fully in the street now. The second district was 40 minutes behind it. In the third district, someone had already begun pulling down a public installation bearing his image. He sat on the floor of his command deck and did not stand for 4 hours. 3 days passed. The human fleets held their positions at every Tharric border point, blocking transit in and out without firing a shot. No communication from the human side, no ultimatum, no demand, just presence, the particular kind of presence that communicates more through patience than through action. On Vorinth Prime, the Dominion tore itself apart efficiently. The regional governors fragmented first, each one calculating independently that distance from the central government was now a survival advantage. The military council attempted 3 separate statements, each contradicting the previous. Gareth Venn was removed from his bunker by his own palace guard on the second day, which was faster than most of his staff had expected and slower than the streets had been demanding. The Reformation Council had existed for 11 years as a political faction too small to matter, advocating positions that the majority had considered naive. They had opposed the Varath action publicly, loudly, and at some personal cost to their members. In the aftermath of the carrier broadcast, they were the only organized political body in the capital that had not been implicated in the action and had not celebrated it. By the end of the third day, they were the only functioning government on Vorinth Prime. The quiet city, the one that had stayed silent while the others rioted, had been the Reformation Council's base of organization for 3 years. Yenna had noted that city on her tactical feed. She had never mentioned it to anyone. She would only understand why it had been quiet when she read the post-war political histories 18 months later. Elder Tesva Owen made contact on the morning of the 4th day. She was older than the images Aldrin had seen of her in intelligence files. The 3 years since those were taken had done something to the lines around her eyes, deepened them in the particular way of someone who has been correct about something terrible for a long time. She wore no insignia, no rank markers. Her clothing was plain Tharric civilian dress in a muted color that had no name in human vocabulary. She looked directly at the screen and said, "We are not them, we are what they suppressed." Aldrin looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I know." She outlined the Reformation Council's position in 3 sentences. Unconditional surrender, full access to military records. Gareth Venn and the other architects of the Varath action offered for whatever process humanity required. Aldrin acknowledged each point. Then he outlined his 3 conditions. The first 2 she received without visible reaction. Tribunal, yes. Full military dismantlement with a generation-long prohibition on force projection. Hard, but yes. The third condition made her pause. A cultural exchange program, she said. You want our children to learn your history, and ours to learn yours, Aldrin said. I want your grandchildren to know ours as people before they know us as the species that defeated you, and I want our grandchildren to know yours the same way. She was quiet for several seconds. You could have destroyed us. Yes, and instead you want to teach our children. Instead, Aldrin said, I want neither of our grandchildren to ever have to do what we just did. Tesva Owen's hands, visible on the lower edge of the screen, tightened against each other. her 3 fingers on each hand interlaced in a Tharric gesture that the intelligence files described as involuntary distress response. "We expected destruction," she said. Her voice had changed. Something in it had loosened. "We prepared ourselves for it. We told ourselves we had earned it and that we would accept it with dignity. We had speeches prepared for the end, official ones." A pause. "I wrote mine myself." "I know," Aldrin said. "We did not have a speech for this." "No," he said. "I don't imagine you did." She began to weep, not dramatically, just the quiet kind, the kind that happens when something you have been braced against for a very long time turns out not to be the thing that arrives. Her composure held except for that. "We will accept your terms," she said. "All 3. The tribunal convened 6 weeks later under Galactic Council authorization, reconstituted for the purpose after the old council's structural collapse. 12 species provided judges. The proceedings were public and ran for 9 days. Gareth Venn sat in the defendant's position stripped of his insignia, the ritual scarification on his throat plate, 14 marks, 14 campaigns, now a record of a different kind. He answered questions directly and without visible emotion, in the particular manner of someone who has spent weeks arriving at the place where they are now and is no longer surprised by it. The evidence was 217 years of documented human attempts at peaceful coexistence, 1 attack, and the measured response to that attack. The gap between what had been done to humanity and what humanity had done in return was its own kind of testimony. The verdict, guilty on all primary counts. Gareth Venn's final statement to the tribunal was brief. He had not prepared it in advance, which was apparent from the cadence. Slower than his usual precision, the vibration membrane working through something as he produced it. "I understood your weapons too late," he said. "I never understood your restraint at all. I still don't." A pause. "I think that is the point. The execution was carried out the following morning. It was not broadcast. The judgment had been public. The end was private. Humanity had no interest in the spectacle of it. AF5 was resolved without theater, the way everything else had been. Yenna spent 4 months on Tharric colony worlds. Her assignment was reconstruction coordination, medical stations, food distribution, infrastructure repair in residential districts that had been damaged by the civil unrest during the Dominion's collapse. She worked with a team of 43 humans, and after the first 2 weeks, an increasing number of Tharric volunteers who arrived without being asked and did not explain themselves beyond showing up. The residents of her assigned district avoided her for 11 days. Not hostility exactly, more like the careful distance of people trying to calibrate something they did not have previous data for. On the 12th day, a Tharric child of about 7 approached her station while she was logging supply inventory. The child stood at a careful distance and watched her work for approximately 2 minutes. Then she asked, in halting human standard that she had clearly just learned, "Do you know singing?" Yenna looked up from her console. "A little," she said. The child waited. Yenna sang the first verse of a colony song she had learned as a child herself, a simple one, about the shape of a new world scene from a landing shuttle. She sang it badly. She had always sung it badly. Her voice went flat on the second line, and she knew it and kept going. The child laughed. It was a Tharric laugh, which involved a rattling in the upper exoskeletal ridge that sounded like something was loose inside a box, and it was, somehow, recognizably the sound of a child who had heard something unexpectedly funny. Yenna laughed too. This was the beginning of something she would not have a name for until much later. The formal signing took place on Kolleth Station, the neutral orbital that would become the founding site of the Galactic Union. The memorial corridor ran the full length of the station. Every delegate who attended the signing walked past 220,000 names to reach the chamber. The Tharric delegation sat across the table from the human delegation, with representatives from 11 other species arranged around them. Tesva On was present. She looked steadier than she had on the screen 6 weeks ago, which Aldrin noted from his position in the observer gallery above. Yenna was at the table. She was the junior human delegate, present as part of the humanitarian operations team. her ranking technically insufficient for the occasion, except that Aldrin had requested her specifically, and no one had argued. Before the formal documents were brought out, she reached into her uniform pocket. She set the command seal on the table between the two delegations. Titanium alloy disc, 9 centimeters across, edges worn smooth from 28 years of daily contact. The fleet designation etched in script too fine to read without magnification. No one asked what it was. Tesva Owen looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the observer gallery, found Aldrin without apparent difficulty, and held his gaze. He nodded once. No one asked what the nod meant either. When Yenna placed the command seal on the negotiating table between the two delegations, no one asked what it was. They all understood. It was the thing her grandfather had carried instead of using, and the reason the war had lasted exactly as long as it needed to and not 1 hour more. The farm on Reservoir III was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. On the counter beside where the tin had been sat a ceramic jar of fermented grain product. No note. His neighbor's jar, the one from 14 months ago, had been removed at some point and replaced with a new one. He did not know when. He had not asked. Some things you accept as the form communication takes when words are insufficient. He refrigerated this one. Yenna came 3 weeks after the signing, on the first of what would become annual visits. She arrived in the late afternoon on a shuttle that landed on the pad behind the greenhouse, and the engine cooled with its familiar ticking sound while she walked up to the porch where he was sitting with 2 cups of something hot that was better than it looked. They talked for a long time. She told him about the Tharric child. He told her about the simulations, the ones he had run every night for 28 years, and how on the night after the surrender, he had sat down at the console at 2 in the morning and looked at it for a while and then gone to bed without opening it. First time in 28 years. He had slept until 7, which was also a first. She was quiet for a moment after he said that. Then she said, "I got your message during the campaign about grandmother." He looked at his cup. "I sent it the morning the carrier launched," he said. "I didn't know what was going to happen. I had the simulations, but simulations are not the same thing." He paused. "I should have said it a long time before that." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had when she was small, and the way she hadn't in a long time because she had grown up and because he was not, by nature, someone who invited that kind of gesture. He let her. The 3 suns were dropping toward the ridge line. Their shadows fell long across the nitrogen rows, 3 separate shadow lines running parallel for a while before they merged into one. Inside on the kitchen shelf, the tin sat beside nothing. He had put the seal on a different shelf after Coloth Station. No particular reason. Or rather, the reason was that the seed packets had a shelf and the tin had always shared it, and now the tin was empty and the shelf was for seeds. He would plant the eastern beds tomorrow. The nitrogen readings in the southern sector still ran slightly warm. He had looked at that when he arrived back and had stood over the ventilation grate for a moment and then walked away and let it be what it was. The shuttle's engine had finished cooling. Yenna's next mission started in 4 days. She would be back in 5 months or 8 or whenever the work allowed. The 3 suns touched the ridge line together, briefly, before the first one dropped below. The rows stretched out even and quiet in the long light, and the seeds he had planted the week before his return were already showing the first green above the soil, small and particular, and not yet anything, growing toward a light they could not see but had always known was there.